worries at all. I understand it's hard to connect sometimes.
Yeah. So can we just start?
Sure, absolutely. I will
Oh,
go ahead.
okay.
Oh,
Sorry, I just want to briefly introduce you to everyone.
sure.
Okay, thank you. So, hi everyone. Welcome to a series of lectures on health communication organized by School of Journalism and Communication of Beijing Normal University. Today's guest is Kevin Wright, who is a well-known scholar in communication field. His work has been published on many top communication journals, such as Journal of Communication, Communication Monograph, and Health Communication. I'm very pleased to welcome Kevin Wright for the lecture today.
Oh, thank you so much, and good morning to everybody there. It's evening here, but it's an honor for me to talk with you today. And I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen with everybody, just so you can see my presentation slides. Is everybody able to see that?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, I'll go ahead and start the slideshow here. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I wanted to talk a little bit about a program of research that I've been involved with for over 20 years now, which is looking at online support communities, looking at the communication processes that occur within these communities and how they relate to health outcomes. It's wonderful to be able to participate by Zoom tonight. I have traveled to China several times in the past, but now due to COVID-19, unfortunately, all of our travel has been suspended from the United States. But this is wonderful to be able to come to you today via Zoom. So I'm going to begin by talking about the growth of health-related online support communities. And as I said, I've been researching this topic for over 20 years, and a lot has changed in the new media landscape since that time. So I began researching health-related online support communities in the 1990s. And at the time, there was probably a few thousand health-related online support communities on the internet. And during those days, really, they were more or less asynchronous bulletin board types of platforms. So people would post something, a concern that they had about a health issue, and then somebody would respond to them over time. Then you started to see more and more synchronous groups where people were communicating in real time. But then, from 2000 to 2010, you saw a dramatic increase in the number of these communities, and it really paralleled the rise of social media platforms. My 6-year-old son can't imagine a world without Facebook and other social media platforms, but I grew up at a time when we really didn't have any of this, and so I actually began my career looking at face-to-face support groups and communities, particularly Alcoholics Anonymous and other similar groups in the United States. But when I first was introduced to the internet and saw the potential for these types of support groups to occur online, it made me think about how that would change the nature of social support. And so back in the 1990s, I began researching these groups, and at the time was really no platforms like Qualtrics that were available to do online surveys. So at the time, I had to do a lot of my surveys, creating them, writing HTML code and things of that nature to actually be able to conduct surveys. So a lot has changed. It's a lot easier now to be able to research these groups because of the tools that we now have. And then from 2010 and to 2020, during the last decade, we've seen a shift in online support communities. They have basically become groups or communities that can be accessed by mobile phone applications. So more and more people are accessing these groups and platforms through smartphones and mobile applications. And so you see a lot of these groups now on social media platforms such as Facebook. I realize that in China, there are other platforms like WeChat and so forth. but it's been interesting to see how these communities have evolved over the years. And today there are online support communities for just about any health topic that you can imagine or health issue. Recently I've been doing a lot of work with online support communities for people who are what we call COVID-19 long haulers. These are people who have recovered from COVID-19, but they're still experiencing health issues from the virus. And so many of these groups have now become popular in the United States and worldwide. And just to give you an example of the growth of Facebook, I remember a time, in the early 2000s when there was no Facebook, but now we see, this interconnection between individuals all over the world. And notably, there are areas where some countries don't have Facebook and so forth, and there are regions of the world where you don't see this particular platform. But to me, it's very intriguing that you could obtain social support for health issues from people, at least in the United States, from all over the country, all 50 states. And certainly there are groups where people support one another from different regions of the world. So it's become a global phenomenon. So just to give some background, many of you probably know a little bit about how stress and other problems that are related to living with a health issue, and this could be anything from substance abuse like alcoholism, HIV, or some other disease, eating disorders, mental health issues. There's a whole variety of health issues that people face, and for many individuals, this is very stressful for them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how stress can influence our mental and physical health. So part of this goes back to the limbic system in our bodies, the physiological processes. And so stress tends to have a very negative effect on our health. And so stress can have positive influences. Stress kind of motivates us sometimes, gets us up in the morning and motivates us to do our work. But it also triggers a number of processes within the body's limbic system. And so all of you are probably familiar with the concept of fight or flight. And so this is something through evolution. Our body basically responds to stressful situations in a way that prepares the body for rapid physical action. Now we're no longer having to worry about saber-toothed tigers and the threats that people may have faced, long ago. But even, psychological stress, just being worried about one's prognosis of being diagnosed with COVID-19 or another disease, or living with something like alcoholism. All of these things generate a lot of stress that can affect people in negative ways because of what happens with the body's limbic system. So at the psychological level, people appraise stressful events, including stressors that are related to health issues, and they appraise them in terms of their severity and duration. So is this a short-term problem? Is it a long-term problem? In terms of physiological processes, sensory neurons sense changes to our body due to environmental stimuli and relay this information to the brain. The limbic system activates the hypothalamus, which controls the body's stress response to stressful situations. And neurons associated with the limbic system can influence cardiovascular activity and immune system response through neurotransmitters in the bloodstream. And these neurotransmitters trigger the release of chemicals such as adrenaline, which gives people energy for that fight or flight response, and also other chemicals such as cortisol, which venerates blood vessels, which helps them to absorb oxygen, more quickly. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some research that we're doing, actually looking at cortisol levels in individuals. So over time, cortisol can damage blood vessels and allow for the buildup of fatty nutrients in the heart and arteries, which leads to heart disease. Also, the release of adrenaline and cortisol over time can disturb the body's immune system and increase negative psychological states. And so that's one of the links between psychological stress and actually physical health problems. So a person who's dealing with a health issue like COVID-19 or substance abuse or whatever it might be, is dealing with a lot of stress, and this stress can actually exacerbate the problems that they are experiencing physically, because it weakens the immune system. It can lead to things like heart disease, and also influence psychological states like depression. Okay, so this can lead to a variety of physical and mental health problems for people who are experiencing stress due to living with a health issue. All right, the good news is that many decades now of research and studies have found that social support can buffer or moderate the negative effects of stress. So when we have a good social support network that we can turn to, this can actually help to reduce stress and also the negative effects of stress on the body. Typically, people will turn to their closer ties, friends and family members, to get social support. But there's a lot of research that suggests that closer ties are not necessarily the best for people sometimes. For instance, you may have a health problem that your family doesn't really understand. If you have a substance abuse issue like alcoholism, other people in your family who are not alcoholics may not really understand why you drink excessively, or they might not be comfortable talking to you about something like cancer or a health problem that is associated with death. And so we'll talk about how online support groups can actually help people who may lack, I guess, social support resources in their closer ties like friends and family. But studies have shown that social support is linked to lower disease morbidity and mortality rates, faster recovery times when people are in the hospital, and also improve psychological outcomes. So there's been a number of studies over the years that have documented that. But when you look at the processes by which social support influences stress, it's complicated. And as a communication researcher, a lot of the complications are due to relational issues, being able to talk about things like disease and stressful situations that one is going through. There are different types of support that we receive both in the face-to-face world and online. And these are kind of the big ones. So sometimes the type of support that we receive is informational support. So if you have for instance, pancreatic cancer, you may not know a lot about it. And maybe your members of your family don't know a lot about pancreatic cancer, or any of your friends. But you can go online and join an online support community where you can meet hundreds of people who are living with that type of cancer and might have a lot of good information that might be helpful for helping you to make choices about what you should do about your own health. Also, there's emotional support that is provided in online communities. So many times people are just kind of there for others. They express empathy and understanding of one's situation and health problems. Sometimes instrumental support can be, I'm trying to think of the right word. It's something that can be given, I guess, through online communities. So many online communities now that are support communities are actually associated with a face-to-face community. So here where I live in Northern Virginia, my wife belongs to a number of support communities for moms, basically. And sometimes if she needs something, another mom who is online, who she doesn't even know, will actually bring something that is useful for our kids by the house, or will provide something that's actually tangible. So this is a form of instrumental support. Other times people provide what's known as esteem support or validation. Many times, if somebody has a stigmatized health condition like HIV, substance abuse like alcoholism, a lot of people in their primary social network, close friends and family members, may not really understand why the person drinks excessively, or understands what it's like to live with something like HIV or another disease. And so sometimes these groups can provide validation, say, you know, you're not the only one out there who's experiencing these problems. This is a legitimate problem. There are others here who can help you. There's also companionship, which is a type of support, which is essentially friendships that are formed within these online communities. And then finally, there's what's known as social control, which is kind of a negative type of social support. This is when many times our closer ties engage in this type of behavior. So if somebody is an alcoholic and is drinking excessively, family members might hide alcohol from them or do things to try to prevent them from drinking excessively. That usually leads to a negative response from the person who's dealing with this particular issue. All right, so starting back in the 1990s, as I mentioned, I started to look at advantages of health-related social support communities that are online. And so, you know, at the time, as I said, there were a number of these on the internet, and it's changed quite a bit. But in my own research and looking at the research of others, we've identified a number of advantages that these online social support communities have over traditional sources of social support like friends and family. So one advantage is access to large numbers of similar others. Here in the United States, if somebody's living in a small town, and the same would be true in China, you may not know anybody else who has COVID-19 or pancreatic cancer or some health issue that you're dealing with. But you can go on to an online community and find, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of other people who are all dealing with similar issues. And so it's a portal essentially for finding others who are dealing with the same type of problem. Also, there's an experience-based credibility with health issues that these groups provide. So many times, since people are living with a health condition, they have you know, information that might be very helpful to you if you're dealing with that same health situation. And so one of the people I interviewed in a study said, this is a online cancer support group. One of my participants said, you know, an oncologist can tell you a lot about cancer and the course of the disease, but they may not know what it's like to live with cancer, what it's like to fear dying and live with the disease on a day-to-day basis, unless they've actually had the disease themselves. So I think a lot of people are drawn to the fact that they meet others in these online communities who have actually lived with the disease or a health issue for a long period of time and can offer you know, credible information. There's also increased opportunities for social comparisons. And by this, I mean, you can look at others who are dealing with a similar health issue and see how they're doing. So if you are a newly recovering alcoholic and you're trying to quit drinking and you've been sober maybe for a week or two, you can see somebody in one of these communities who's been sober for 10 or 15 or 20 years and ask them, you know, what did you do? What steps did you take to quit drinking for this long period of time? So that can give people hope when they see other people who have recovered from something like alcoholism. With cancer communities, they might see somebody who's doing really well, whose cancer has gone into remission, and they've been living with the disease for a long time, but they've you know, their prognosis is much better. So you could ask people, you know, what medications did you take? What things did you do? And so I think people will try to emulate others who are doing well with their particular health issue. So we call that an upward social comparison. You can also see benefit from downward comparisons. Many times people, for instance, who are alcoholics who've been sober for 10 or 15 years, they can see somebody who's new to the group, who's struggling with alcoholism and might be having all kinds of problems with their job and their family and relationships because of their drinking. And that's a reminder, I better not start drinking again. Otherwise, I might end up, you know, having the problems that this person who's new to the group is experiencing. So these social comparisons are very important. Also, you get very specialized informational support about particular health issues. I remember when my wife and I, we have two boys, and one's 3 and the other is 6. But when our 6-year-old was a baby, my wife joined a breastfeeding support group, and I would sit in her meetings with her, and these were face-to-face meetings. But it was interesting. I had no idea women experience so many issues related to breastfeeding, problems with breastfeeding, and all of this. And so actually, some physicians ended up attending the groups because the women who were leading the group and talking had lots of information based on their experience with breastfeeding. And so the doctors actually found that attending these meetings were useful because they learned a lot about breastfeeding issues that they may not be aware of from their own readings. And there's also increased opportunities for emotional support. Sometimes it's hard to get empathy for certain health conditions. So for instance, lung cancer, HIV, these are health conditions that are often stigmatized. So if somebody gets HIV, many times we blame the victim, essentially saying, well, your unsafe sex practices led you to get HIV, or smoking a lot led you to get lung cancer. And so people may not be very empathetic about why a person has a certain health condition. And so when you're in a large online community and other people are dealing with the same things that you are health-wise, it's more likely that you'll encounter people who will be empathetic towards your condition. We've also, in studies that I've done with others, most notably Claude Miller and Steve Rains, we actually found that these online communities are really good at reducing stigma. And so when people feel stigmatized due to their health condition, these groups can actually reduce that stigma and make them feel better about themselves. All right. These communities can also provide support for health behavior maintenance. And so individuals are able to maintain health behaviors, healthy lifestyles and things by having that support that they can turn to on a day-to-day basis. Many times there are fewer relational communication issues compared to traditional sources of social support like close ties. So many times family members, for instance, don't want to talk to somebody who has cancer about cancer because they feel like they're overstepping their bounds, boundaries with that individual, or they just try to change the subject and talk about other things. And maybe the person actually does want to talk about their cancer diagnosis and what they're going through. But sometimes talk about things that are associated with death, like cancer, makes people feel very uncomfortable. And so there's documented research that has shown that many times people who are living with cancer have trouble getting the support they need from their own family members because nobody really wants to talk about it. But online, people are willing to talk about these issues. There's some research that writing out your thoughts in an online support community can actually have therapeutic writing benefits, because when you write out how you're feeling, it creates a psychological distance between what's in your head and seeing it, on the screen. And there's some research that has found that actually can make people more introspective about what they're going through, and they can kind of see their thoughts in a different light, and it actually reduces things like stress and depression. My colleague Steve Rains, who I've done a lot of research with, he's done a number of meta-analyses that have looked at online support groups and has found some compelling data, basically, that it shows that these groups are good at reducing morbidity and mortality rates, or they're associated with reduced morbidity and mortality. So these groups have actually been linked to better health outcomes. And work that I've done with Steve Rains as well, we've found that it's people who use these groups have lower levels of depression and stigma and increased psychological well-being. So these groups do seem to have positive health benefits for people who use them. All right. So in my own research and many other studies, people who've been researching online support communities over the years like to rely on a number of theoretical frameworks. And so I've just kind of listed some of them that you'll commonly see if you read the literature on online support communities. And so I've used all of these frameworks, and I was kind of taught to use theory as a way to drive your research study. And so I won't talk about all of these theories tonight or this morning for you, but I will talk about some of the empirical studies that I've been involved in that have used some of these. And so most notably, I'm going to talk about optimal matching model and also the strength of weak ties theory that Mark Granovetter came up with. Okay, so just turning a little bit to some of the studies I've done on online support communities and health outcomes. This is a study that was published in 2015, and this was a meta-analytic review of studies of online support groups that had conducted content analyses. So we're basically looking at the types of messages that were exchanged in various online support communities to see if we could find some patterns with how people, with the types of support people received and how they coped with their particular health condition. So for this study, we looked at something called action facilitating types of support. So this includes informational support and tangible support, or instrumental support, as I defined it earlier. And usually people seek this type of support if they have a health condition that can be improved in some way by getting the information or tangible support. So with some health conditions, information might lead you to take a certain type of medication or surgical procedure or something that might actually reduce your risk of dying or having negative problems due to a health issue. In other cases, the dominant type of support you see in these communities might be more what we call nurturance support, which is emotional, network, esteem support. This helps individuals cope with the emotional consequences of a stressor. So sometimes there might not be anything you can do about having stage 4 cancer, right? You're probably going to die sooner rather than later. But these groups can actually provide emotional support that may help people who are living with cancer cope better with that disease. We also drew upon what's known as optimal matching, the optimal matching model, which I had on as one of the major theoretical frameworks. And just to get into this a little bit deeper, we were particularly interested in Cutrone and Russell's dimensions of desirability, controllability, life domain, and duration of consequences. So desirability is the degree to which a stressor has potential to result in a gain or a loss for a person. Controllability is the degree to which health problems are controllable or uncontrollable. Life domain is the impact of illness on a person's personal or professional relationships. And then duration of consequences is looks at the length of illness-related stressors. So I won't go through all of these research questions and hypotheses, but basically, based on this theoretical framework, we had one question that we just wanted to know, which types of social support messages are most common in health-related computer-mediated contexts. So in this case, we were looking at online support communities. And then we had a number of hypotheses that were based on predictions from earlier research that had stemmed from the optimal matching model framework. So in this study, we did a meta-analytic review of 41 published content analysis studies that had looked at social support messages that were shared in health-related online contexts. Most of them were what I would consider online support communities. And each condition was coded. We had 3 of us who worked on the study, and 2 of us served as independent coders. And each condition was coded as having a relatively lower or higher likelihood of loss, stigma, controllability, et cetera. And I didn't report the Krippendorf's alpha for this, but it was pretty good. We had a decent intercoder reliability. It was close to 0.90, which is a good number when you're doing intercoder reliabilities. And so these are some of the conditions that we looked at, and you can kind of see how we coded these different dimensions from the optimal matching model framework. And so we looked at everything from anxiety to arthritis, breast cancer, breastfeeding, cancer, depression, diabetes, HIV, and AIDS. So we looked at a variety of studies that have looked at social support messages within these types of online groups or communities. And in terms of the results, we found that nurturing forms of support, like emotional support, esteem support, and validation, were most common among stigmatized health conditions and conditions that were likely to threaten personal relationships, and also in conditions that were likely to result in death. And so with these conditions, you tended to see a lot more emotional support, esteem support, and validation if somebody was living with this type of health issue. And then you tended to see more action facilitating support or informational support in communities where the health issue was less stigmatized and people were dealing with more chronic health conditions. So conditions that lasted a long time, but death was not imminent. And so in those cases, there was more sharing of informational support and tangible support, whereas in conditions where death was more likely to occur and it was more stigmatized, et cetera, you tended to see more nurturing types of support. So that was just an interesting finding, looking at how different online support communities provide different types of social support depending on the type of health condition and stressors people were dealing with. So the findings were largely consistent with the optimal matching theory dimensions of desirability, controllability, visibility, and duration, as well as stigmatization. The issue with meta-analyses or meta-analytic reviews, as many of you probably know, you can only really use them to examine the prevalence of things like supportive messages, but it gives you no data about the quality of the messages or how they were perceived by the support recipient. So content analysis and meta-analysis doesn't allow you to kind of tap into whether somebody thought the support was useful or helpful. It just kind of looks at the prevalence of different types of support. All right, and another study, or series of studies, I should say, we wanted to look at what's known as the strength of weak ties theory, which was originally created in the 1970s by a sociologist by the name of Mark Granovetter. And so I'll talk a little bit about weak ties, but basically in the 70s, Granovetter was looking at weak ties that were offline or face-to-face, not online. But his work was kind of revisited once the internet started to evolve and you started to see people communicating with others within online communities. So traditionally, a weak tie might be somebody like a neighbor who you might talk to every once in a while, but you don't really consider them to be a close, relationship. Or somebody maybe who cuts your hair that you talk to once a month, for 10 minutes. In the United States, many times bartenders and people will talk to a bartender and disclose information to that person for a very short period of time, even though that person is not close to them. And so actually, the last time I was in China, I was coming back on a flight from Beijing to Washington, D.C., and the woman who was sitting next to me proceeded to tell me her entire life story and all this stuff that was going on with her in terms of her health issues and things. And so the thinking behind this is that people will do this sometimes to a complete stranger because there's no risk involved. If you're never going to see somebody again, why not unload all of this information on them? You might be able to get some advice from the person or feedback from them, but you don't have to worry about ever seeing that person again and that person knowing your closer ties. And so so there are certain types of support that can be provided by weak ties. And one of the things that Granovetter and others have found in a variety of studies is that one reason people seek out weak ties is they desire more diverse points of view or information. So our close friends tend to be people who are similar to us. It's called the homophily principle. We tend to seek out relationships with people who we share similarities with. And our family members tend to be more similar to us than they are different. And so that essentially cuts off the diversity of information that we could receive about certain topics. So for instance, if you're an alcoholic and nobody you know in your family is an alcoholic, and none of your friends are alcoholics, they may have a very limited view of alcoholism and what one can do about it. And so going online to an online support community, you're going to meet all of these other people who are not going to be close ties. They're going to be weaker ties. You're meeting them online. They're strangers essentially, but they bring to the table lots of different life experiences and perspectives about a health problem. Also, role obligations are something we see with closer ties. If a friend of mine calls me at 1 a.m, I will probably answer the phone and talk to them if they have a problem. I don't necessarily want to talk to them about their problems at 1 a.m, but I do it because that's what being a friend is about. That's a role obligation that's associated with that relationship. So when you're talking to weaker ties, you tend to see fewer role obligations. People will support each other, not because they have to, but because they're willing to do so for the good of the group or the community. Also, people sometimes seek out weaker ties because they want more objective advice. Sometimes the people who are closest to us are not able to give us objective advice. They know us too well, basically. And so they may tell us to do things that may not be the best options for us. And also, our closer ties are really bad sometimes about judging us. So, what, you have lung cancer? It's because you smoked for the last 20 years. I told you not to smoke, or, you have HIV. You should have practiced, safe sex or something. And, you deserve to have it because you were not careful. And so many times our closer ties will judge us, for problems that we are experiencing, particularly health issues. So we kind of drew upon this theory or framework to see, do people kind of vary in terms of their preference for weak tie support versus strong tie support? But at the time, there was not a scale that really measured this. So this particular study was a scale development study. And so based on this literature, we came up with 4 dimensions of weak tie support network preference. So one we called utility, which kind of dealt with reduced role obligations and kind of similarity between people who situational similarity. So in other words, you may not know the person very well. They might be a stranger, but you share a similarity in the sense that maybe you're dealing with living with the same type of disease or health condition as that person. Objectivity is that less emotional attachment, reduced risk. So you don't have to worry about disclosing your deepest, darkest fears to somebody online who's a stranger, because you don't have to worry about that information getting back to your loved ones, your family, and your friends. It's kind of a safe environment to disclose information. And then comfort was kind of more of a strong tie variable that we looked at, whether people get their needs met by strong ties. So this study and developing this scale, and I'll only talk about a little of it, we did basically 2 studies of 2 populations. So we looked at online support community members and then also college students as a way to kind of test out the scale that we developed. And basically we used confirmatory factor analysis using structural equation modeling. And so essentially we had the people from an online support community complete these measures, and we had other measures of discriminant validity and convergent validity and other things that we were looking at. But basically the factor structure panned out pretty well. The items loaded onto the dimensions in a way that we expected. So I won't go through all the math of confirmatory factor analysis, but essentially the results were promising when we calculated this for the online support community sample. And we also did another study of undergraduate students because it was a convenience sample. And basically for this sample, we found very similar findings. So it was nice that within 2 populations, we were able to see items load onto the dimensions as we expected they would theoretically. All right. Also, other things we found compared to healthy undergraduate students, online support community users, and these are all health related, or this was a health related online support community. They had a greater preference for utility, objectivity, and reduced risk judgment. In other words, they preferred weak tie support. And the weak tie, strong tie preference dimensions were also related to reduced stress and increased self-efficacy. It was much stronger for the online support community sample than it was for the undergraduate student sample. But even with the undergraduates, we found those relationships, which we thought were interesting, that this weak tie support can, in fact, reduce stress and lead people to feel better, that they could do something about their health situation. So communicating with people who are weaker ties in online support communities, they help people with health conditions feel more comfortable disclosing sensitive information. And I found that in a variety of studies. Back in the 90s, when I first started doing research and interviews with people who are online support community members, I looked at one group that was an HIV AIDS group. And I remember many of the people telling me, this is the first place that I ever told anybody that I was HIV positive. So they were afraid to tell their family and close friends that they were HIV positive, but they felt comfortable going online to this community and talking to strangers who also had HIV, but that freed them up to kind of reveal that they had HIV, and they were able to get lots of advice and feedback from these individuals, and it was something that helped to reduce their stress. So weak ties in online support communities may provide greater heterogeneity of information. I kind of talked about that issue about health issues compared to traditional closer ties. So once we had the scale developed, we started to use it in a variety of studies. So I'll just talk about one study, but Steve Rains, who's at the University of Arizona, he's a colleague of mine that I've published numerous studies with. And so we use this scale to do a study of an online support community. So basically, this study used 235 participants from online support communities dealing with stigmatized health concerns such as HIV/AIDS, eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia, substance abuse issues like alcoholism. And the respondents, the mean age was 51.9, but they ranged from 19 to 85. And in the survey, we had the weak tie, strong tie preference scale measure that I developed with Claude Miller in 2010. We also looked at perceived health-related stigma, perceived stress, and depression. And so using regression, we controlled for age, sex, and health status, but we also looked at stigma and weak tie preference, and then interaction effects for stigma and weak tie preference. And so it was really interesting to do the study because one of the things we found was that weak tie preference moderated the relationship between the stigma one felt due to their health condition and stress. So essentially, they may have had high stress, but due to stigma, but the weak tie, communicating with weak ties in these online communities helped to reduce stress. We found similar findings. Weak tie preference moderated the relationship between stigma and depression. And so basically what this study shows is that, this weak tie process that happens and communicating with weak ties and online health-related support communities may be beneficial in terms of reducing stigma and helping things like stress and depression, which are important mental health outcomes. So weak tie preference appears to moderate the effects of stigma on stress and depression. And these weak ties within online support communities may help people with health issues reduce the stigma that's associated with their condition and ultimately improve their health outcomes. So I've engaged in a number of other studies that were similar, and we found consistent findings across, I think, 10 to 12 studies now where we've looked at similar variables with different types of support groups and communities that are online. So that's encouraging that across studies we're seeing this pattern happen. All right. So where does this kind of leave us? There's a lot I could talk about the future of this research, but just some future directions and challenges for researchers who want to conduct this type of research, particularly if you wanted to do an online support community intervention. So, you're worried about a particular health issue and you want to create a support website or community for individuals to go to. I think there's a lot of promise there, but I think there's some things that people need to be aware of. And so one is that we've tended to rely on theories that were developed in the face-to-face world, and we tried to fit them into studying online communities. And so I think there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes. I think the theories do work well, but in some cases, but we need new theories that kind of account for the ways in which online communication or communication within online communities differs from face-to-face communities in terms of social support. And so, some studies will, particularly ones that are intervention studies, many of them kind of use the same theoretical frameworks over and over again. Another tool that we have now, which is I'm starting to use, we have programs like Python, which allow researchers to auto code messages that are distributed between online support community members. So I've had to learn Python, but now I'm able to actually essentially extract, exchanges between people in these online communities when they share messages. And we can also code, how many people like the message, share the message with somebody else, and a lot of other engagement issues. How many people respond to certain messages? And we're also starting to use these programs and integrate them with other programs like social network analysis software. So we can basically get a picture of who's talking to whom within a social network, within an online community. So we can look at the clusters of the people are talking to one another a lot versus people are more socially isolated within the community. And we can also look at the types of supportive messages these individuals are exchanging with one another. So compared to the 1990s, when I first started doing this research, thankfully we have computer programs and other software and things that we can use that help us do more sophisticated research of these communities. Also, you've probably heard a lot about misinformation about health issues. Sadly, in our country, we have a lot of misinformation that's being spread about COVID-19 right now, which is creating problems. And it's one of the reasons we're not able to contain this particular pandemic in the United States. We're far worse off than many other countries around the world. And so a lot of misinformation about, COVID-19 is being spread. But my concern is that, even though you have people who might be dealing with certain health issues, some people might intentionally go and spread misinformation within these communities, which may lead to false hope about one's prognosis with dealing with something like cancer or another health issue. And so we really need to do more studies about misinformation and how that might affect people negatively within these communities. Another issue that's really difficult to untangle is there are often many causal paths from online support to health outcomes, and this is difficult to assess. For one thing, is people often use online support communities for social support, but then they also get support from family members and friends. So it's hard to tease out, is the benefit in terms of health outcomes from social support, is that due to the online support community, or is it due to their traditional face-to-face, closer tie social networks? And so it's really tough sometimes to figure out, what's influencing positive health outcomes that we might see in studies. So these are all things that I grapple with in terms of the research that I'm doing. And moving forward, I'm hoping that some of these new methods will allow us to look at this phenomenon of online social support in new ways and better link it to health outcomes for people who are members of these communities. But we still have a lot to learn. Even though it's been over 20 years, I still feel like I have more questions about how these communities work and how they're beneficial to people than when I started. And I think that's true of any program of research. The more you dig and try to understand a phenomenon in public health or in health communication, the more questions are raised. And so I suspect that I will continue this line of research for many more years to come. I hope that some of you, as a result of the talk tonight, may look at this literature if you haven't looked at it already and may be interested. I'm about to move to question and answers, but I would really be interested in hearing what types of online social support communities and platforms are used in China, because most of my research has been done in the United States and a little bit in Europe, but I have not done as much with other countries. Particularly, I have done some research with people, scholars in China, but I think it's an area that I would like to study more and hear about opportunities there might be for conducting this type of research in China. So I will just say thank you at this point and open it up to any questions that people might have about the research. I can stop sharing my screen, I think. Oops. Oops. Stop share. There we go. Okay, now I can see it.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so what I found in like Chinese online social support group is that people who join the group are relatively younger, and they are more likely to be women, right? Does it happen in the US?
Yes. So so a lot of it, I'm not so most of the studies I've done, I found that when you look at the proportion of women versus men, you tend to get a lot more female respondents. So I'm not sure if that's a selection bias. In other words, women are more likely to fill out these surveys, or in fact, if are women using these communities more than men? So that's kind of a question that would be interesting to delve into. But it seems like women tend to be better at expressing social support, expressing the need for social support, and also providing support. Men, when it comes to health conditions, tend to be pretty bad. My wife has to drag me kicking and screaming to go to the hospital if I'm sick, and so I'm more reluctant, I think, to seek support. But I think women are maybe it's a socialization issue, but I think women tend to be better at seeking support when they need it, and actually maybe better at providing support. So it's interesting that in China you found something similar.
Yeah, and I also found that a lot of people who join online online social support group, they themselves don't have the health issues, but they joined for their moms or for their fathers, or some even children.
Yeah, that is an interesting phenomenon. So yeah, sometimes people will go to get information for somebody else. So they're not actually living with the health condition. They're trying to find out information for a loved one. So I think that's something that has to be teased out in the research. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now in China, I'm just curious, what is the predominant platform that is used? Is it something like WeChat, or is it different platforms are used?
Yeah, I think they use WeChat for some like private online social support group, and they also use like Weibo. It's more like Twitter. It is kind of open for anyone to join.
I see.
Yeah, right.
Do you have many private groups, or are they all mostly public or open to the public?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure, but I know some people, if they have when they have the cancer, the doctor will provide them like a WeChat group for them to join. And if and some people who join like the Weibo kind of, it's more like a circle, not a group. They have like similar accounts, so they often communicate with each other.
I see.
Yeah.
Now that's really interesting. So it sounds to me that in China, people, medical professionals are aware of the benefits of social
Right.
support and are recommending that as a way to help people, which is great.
Yeah, so the doctor will just set a group for their patients to join.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent.
Mm-hmm.
This is wonderful to hear.
Yeah.
Are there other questions people might have? Oh, I see something in the chat here.
Right.
Are there any studies concerning other types of ties besides the original strong, weak ones? Yeah, this is where I'm getting into having some issues because, you know, I've mainly focused in my research on kind of using that weak tie framework. But, you know, one of the things that I should note is that weak ties always have the potential to become stronger ties, right? So you can meet somebody who's a stranger in one of these groups, find out that you live close to one another and develop a friendship. And so, you know, I think sometimes people will meet somebody it might start off as a weak tie relationship, but then develop into a stronger tie. And so that's something I'm trying to wrestle with now in terms of my own study designs, like maybe looking at you know, how relationships change over time. And of course, you need to collect longitudinal data in order to assess that. But that would be really interesting. But yeah, there are you know, there are social network analysis studies that are out there that kind of look at other characteristics of social networks. So looking at centrality, for instance, are people, you know, kind of in that node or cluster where, you know, people are all communicating with one another? Are people relatively isolated? There's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, there's been a series of studies called the CHESS studies, which was an online community that the University of Wisconsin started for cancer patients, but it's essentially a lab that they can use to study online support among cancer patients. And so they've been pretty sophisticated with their social network analysis and have been able to find out, you know, what are the characteristics of the people, excuse me, who are talking to one another most frequently. They're looking at differences between people who are lurkers and their characteristics, people who are following the group discussion or community discussion, but not actually joining in and participating. And so they found that there are some interesting differences between people who are lurkers versus people who are more active participants. And so people are more active participants, for instance, tend to have better health outcomes. So in other words, if they put it out there, they start talking to people and voicing their concerns within the community, they're more likely to get support from other people, which in turn, you know, helps reduce stress and helps their improve their health outcomes. Whereas lurkers may follow the discussion, but they don't benefit to the same extent as people who are more active participants. So yes, there are some really interesting other characteristics about the social networks within these communities and how they influence health outcomes.
I have another question.
Sure.
Yeah. So do you find is it difficult to reach out to people who have cancer or other health condition like HIV? So if I want to conduct like a questionnaire or just interview them, I found that it might be hard to reach out to them.
Yeah, I'm finding that it's getting harder because in the 90s, when I first started doing this type of research, most of these groups were fewer of them were private, so they were more kind of anybody can join, or there might be a moderator who would you know, follow the discussions and maybe kick somebody out if they said something inappropriate. But it was easier as a researcher to get access to those groups. And now more and more of these groups have become private. So you have to know somebody who's kind of a gatekeeper who's going to allow you to come into the group. And if it's a really stigmatized issue like HIV/AIDS or something that that's difficult for people to talk about, they may not want an outsider or stranger coming in.
Yeah.
Even if you're a researcher trying to benefit the groups or communities ultimately by helping the people to understand what goes on in these groups and how it can benefit health, they may be suspicious of outsiders. And part of the problem is, at least in the United States, pharmaceutical companies have used online support groups as a way to market products. So they say, oh, this is a group that's dealing with cancer. We have this cancer medication, and they'll actually spam or provide advertisements within the group, to try to get customers, basically. And so I think, compared to the 1990s, you've seen that practice happen a lot with this niche marketing that the pharmaceutical companies are using to try to promote their products. And so because of the motives of these companies, many people are suspicious, I think, of outsiders. So I'm finding it's more and more difficult to get access to many of these groups. And so I usually have to know somebody who belongs to one of these groups and have them, facilitate my entry into the group or community.
Thanks.
These are all great questions.
Yeah.
Well, I know it's now, it's been an hour or so since I started talking, so I don't want to keep people from the rest of your day.
Okay.
But I'm happy to answer other questions if, and if there are any other ones.
So if people who don't have any other question, we can just wrap up today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds great. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I hope that you found the research interesting. And feel free to contact me by email or if you have other questions. And I would be delighted to talk with folks more. And if anybody is interested in doing social support research, I'm always interested in finding people to collaborate with, particularly people from different countries, because I'm really interested in it as a global phenomenon, not just a phenomenon within the United States. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care, everybody.